Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to see you here on a warm February night. I first became aware of Dara Goldstein through a publication that was referred to me by some artist friends out in the state of Wyoming, if you can imagine that. And they said, you have to see this journal of food and culture called Gastronomica. And I found a copy and was amazed by this publication that was put out by the University of California Press that was really about that. It was about food, it was about culture, but it was fundamentally a magnificent book that would arrive several times a year, and it would be just literally a visual feast. And then you would dive into the essays, poets, writers, artists. It was a magnificent publication, and I knew that Dara Goldstein was someone that I wanted to work with and share with others. I had the great opportunity 2 years ago to hear Dara speak at the Detroit Institute of Arts on the occasion of the Fabergé exhibition that maybe many of you saw. Dara is an expert on Russian culture and a professor of Russian, and it made perfect sense to invite her to speak on Russian imperial dining, and it was a magnificent and often hilarious presentation. And so it was a great opportunity when we were talking about the Werner Pfeiffer exhibition, which I hope you have either seen or will see soon in the Canada Gallery, because it is a beautiful exploration of the possibilities of paper by this German-born artist who has been an art teacher for decades and has made some magnificent works using paper, but specifically books. And we were talking, and it made sense that there are books that people collect, but even for someone who says they don't really collect books, they probably own a cookbook. So we thought that inviting Dara to come speak on the history of cookbooks would be something that she might be interested in. So I gave her a call, and as it turns out, she was working on developing a class for her students at Williams College, where she teaches, on the history of the cookbook this spring. So it was just meant to be, and she kindly agreed to speak and has developed this talk looking at cookbooks, 7 centuries of visual feasts, which you will dive into momentarily. I just want to give you a little bit of background about Dara and her remarkable career. She is the Wilcox and Harriet Adsit Professor of Russian at Williams College and the founding editor of Gastronomica, the Journal of Food and Culture. Since earning her PhD in Slavic languages and literature from Stanford University, she's published numerous books and articles on Russian literature, culture, art, cuisine, and has organized several exhibitions, including one she was describing earlier today called Feeding Desire, Design and the Tools of the Table, 1500 to 2005. She's also the author of 4 cookbooks, including A Taste of Russia and The Georgian Feast, both of which we have for sale in our store and in a table in Libby Court, because we'll be holding a book signing right after this lecture. So we hope that you'll join us up there and purchase either of those books or the Gastronomica Reader. She is general editor of California Studies in Food and Culture at the University of California Press, a book series that seeks to broaden the audience for serious scholarship in food studies and to celebrate food as a means of understanding the world. She's editor of the forthcoming, and by forthcoming May 1st, Oxford Companion to Sugar and Sweets. And she is finalizing a Scandinavian cuisine cookbook, apropos on a day like today. There will be a time for question and answers, so if you have questions, we just ask that you make your way down to one of 2 microphones so that we can make sure we can hear your question and record it for posterity. So with all that being said, I just ask that you join in welcoming this first-time visitor to Toledo and give her a very warm Toledo welcome. Dara Goldstein.
Thank you all so much for coming out on such a cold night. For me, I'm in my element, but I realize that not everyone feels that way. I want to thank Scott for inviting me here, and also Brian Kennedy and the whole staff of the museum, and actually everyone I have met in Toledo. I've been here less than 24 hours, and I emailed my husband this afternoon and said, you have to come. It's a really wonderful city. I feel like there's so much to explore. So thank you for this warm welcome, and I said when I was devising this talk there would be 7 centuries of visual feasts. It's actually turned into many more. I'm going to try and cover them all rapidly in the small amount of time we have, and really just give you a taste for what cookbooks can be. We tend to think of them as prescriptive manuals that are for use in the kitchen, very utilitarian, functional objects, but they're really so much more. I decided to illustrate this title slide with this cookbook from 1910 because it conveys so much about where our current anxieties are. You know, we worry about, is our food pure? Now we think about GMOs, but back then it was the adulteration of foods, and this comes very much in the wake of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, which was when the FDA was established. But what I really love about this slide is the way the helping hands are there. It's as though the food materializes with these disembodied arms that just present the casserole. There is no work in the kitchen. It's not exactly like that. So the story begins in 1750 BC. This is the first recorded recipe. There are actually a couple of tablets. They're in the collection of Yale, from the Hammurabi period in Babylon. And it's written in cuneiform. I don't pretend that I can even begin to read it, so I obviously am telling you what I have researched. But this tablet contains 7 recipes for wonderful things that are still made in Middle Eastern cuisine, like a sweet and sour meat stew, a wonderful pie that is filled with all kinds of different small, delectable birds. But what's interesting here is it's not really to teach people how to cook. It's more a documentation of cooking practices among the elite. So cooking, even if we think of it as a very mundane kitchen activity, has also been a very high status activity in wealthy households throughout the centuries. And that's something to keep in mind, that the first cookbooks were something that were things that were prized, and they weren't just to be used and to get spattered with grease. So before there were actually cookbooks as we understand them, it is really wonderful to look at old illuminated manuscripts because we can learn a lot about how food was prepared and also served. This is the Luttrell Psalter, English, from 1340. And it shows a whole sequence. This is actually just the final one of butchering meats, cooking them in the kitchen, and here you can see they're being served to the Lord. I want to draw your attention here to the trestles that the table is set up on. Really, until the 17th century, there wasn't, even in the wealthiest households in England, there wasn't such a thing as the dining room. The great halls of the castles were set up for the banquets, and literally a board was set on trestles, and that's where we get our phrase bed and board, if you ever wondered where that came from. The first cookbook in English dates to 1390, and it was a manuscript written, probably dictated to scribes, by the master cooks of King Richard II, and it's called The Form of Cury, C-U-R-Y. When I was first getting interested in food, I thought it was the form of curry, and I was wondering, oh, why was there curry in England then? But it's cury, from the French cuire, to cook. And what you see here is the typical form the recipes took for many centuries. It's basically a block, it's a narrative, and because the vellum or the parchment that the manuscripts were written on were so expensive in terms of material, A lot of the recipes were written with all kinds of superscripts and shorthand, and so they were more like aide-memoire, so that people who already knew how to cook, and these were cooks in professional kitchens, would be able to take a quick look at the recipes and understand what to do. This recipe is to make gunden beans, which is basically a recipe we would enjoy today of mashed beans with bacon. So some things don't change. So what is a recipe? We think of a recipe as something from a cookbook. But actually, the first recipes were medical prescriptions. If you see the slip that your doctor gives you, it has RX, or they write RX on it, and it comes from the Latin recipere, which means take. So literally, the first recipes, which were until the early 20th century in England and the United States known as receipts, were prescriptions. We also find recipes in alchemy, in the text to transform base materials into something miraculous. And those, even though the materials were not edible, that is also a kind of recipe. I came across this wonderful one from around 1400 from the artist Cennino Cennini, and he's talking how to make a batter or flour paste for binding parchments. And he has lots of recipes in the book. But I like this one because it's so culinary. I'm just going to read a little part of it. Take a pipkin, which is a small 3-footed earthenware container, almost full of clear water. Get it quite hot. When it is about to boil, take some well-sifted flour, put it into the pipkin little by little, stirring constantly with a stick or a spoon. Let it boil and do not let it get too thick. Take it out, put it into a porringer, which is a container for porridge. If you want to keep it from going bad, put in some salt, and so use it when you need it. And I love this because it has all of the elements of a good recipe in contemporary America today. You have the authorial voice guiding you, telling you exactly what the process, what the method should be. You learn exactly what equipment you should use. You use a stick or a spoon because, of course, forks had not yet been introduced in 1400 in Italy. And everything, you use clear water, well-sifted flour, so you're using fine ingredients. So a recipe needs to be thought of as something that goes beyond just the purely culinary realm. Again, before there was a proliferation of cookbooks, there were a lot of manuscripts that didn't contain recipes necessarily, but that had to do with people's foremost concerns about eating, which, as today, nothing really ever changes, have to do with health, pleasure and health, the two poles of our existence that are constantly battling one another. This is from the Tarquinum Sanitatis, the Table of Health, which was published in Latin translation in 1475 in Italy from an 11th century treatise that had been published in Arabic. And it is just beautifully, beautifully illustrated, showing all kinds of aspects of daily life and the kinds of foods that are good to eat. Because in Western Europe then, it was very much based on the humoral system of medicine, where the four humors, if they're not in balance, like we talk about not being in a good humor, way back then, it literally was seen to be a reflection of a physical ailment. And so if you were not in a good humor, you had to balance, if you were too hot and dry or too cold and wet, then you had the foods that would balance that. So this is talking about cucurbit, which is squash. And of course, if you've eaten squash, you know that it is moist and has cooling properties. And there are also wonderful scenes of domestic life. And interestingly, and rather weirdly, I think, Mussolini had this republished when he was ruling because he felt that it somehow was a good manual for representing how Italians should be living in the 20th century. This is a very important manuscript from 1465 by a man named Maestro Martino. And what's important about it is it's one of the first cookbook manuscripts, and Italy was in the forefront, France coming in second, for publishing recipes for professional kitchens. So we're really talking about the elite. There wasn't widespread literacy at that time. But this one is important because it shows a move from a kind of medieval style of cooking, which was very heavily spiced, a great use of sugar, to a sort of more naturalistic approach to cooking. You can see that the recipes are still in this block narrative form. They don't have the ingredients isolated. And this also is written in Italian and not in Latin. So the idea is that the audience would be somewhat more widespread. It's in the vernacular, and it's written in this beautiful italic, in the handwriting. And so there's a kind of intimacy that is created from it. The first printed cookbook appeared in 1474, called On Right Cooking and Good Health, by a man named Platina, who eventually became the Vatican librarian. And besides being the first printed cookbook, it's important because he took Maestro Martino's recipes, and there was a lot of plagiarism. Recipes were disseminated in multiple editions, and people claiming that, this is my recipe, but it was actually had been published many times before. He gave credit to Maestro Martino, but then he added his own discourse about how to live well and how to be in good health. It's in Latin. It's in this heavy black lettering, which is it doesn't welcome you into the kitchen. And most of the early cookbooks were like this. They were books that were put not in the kitchen, but they were kept in the library, and then the cooks were told what to do, and again, they were more like reference manuals than actual working ones. All of that changed with this amazing publication by a man, an Italian named Bartolomeo Scappi. In 1570, he published a beautiful volume with 1,000 recipes called Opera, just works. And obviously the printing technology had improved in those intervening years, and there were a lot of gorgeous engravings. And this shows how the well-equipped kitchen should appear. So this is 1570 in Italy. So you see that the cooking technology, for the most part, is still reliant on the hearth, and you have all of these pulleys that raise and lower the cauldrons. Have this wonderful thing here, which is actually a bale of hay for putting the knives in. And if you've ever been pricked by a piece of straw, you know how sharp it is. So it had the added advantage, if you put the knife in, it didn't give it a really fine edge, but it would help to keep it rather well honed. What's truly extraordinary about the kitchen is what you see here. And this is an early raised stove that has a wood fire underneath so that you don't have to tend the open hearth. It was known as the potager, a French name, which would be familiar from the word potage. And it was at, first it was at knee height and then at waist height, so the cook did not have to be so close to this open fire. Extraordinarily, there's running water here. And you can see the makings of pasta, where you roll it out, and you see the word pasta there. He also had wonderful plates showing the catalog of equipment that you would need in a well-stocked kitchen. And I showed this to my students the other day, and one of the students said, "That's Cooks Illustrated." I don't know how many of you, do you know the magazine Cooks Illustrated? It prides itself on line drawings. There's none of this sort of erotic food photography that you find in Food and Wine and some of the other magazines. And, he's right. It goes back to this sort of thing. And Scappi's recipes, again, this block form, But even though it was a printed book, he did it in this very inviting and sort of intimate script so that you don't feel distance from it as you do from, say, the 1581 publication of the first comprehensive German cookbook by a man named Marx Rumpold. This was illustrated with 200 woodcut vignettes, as you see on the title page, by a Swiss artist named Jos Amens and also some other well-known artists of the time. And it's two-color typography. And again, this very heavy, authoritative black lettering and, you know, the Gothic script. You are meant to feel that this is an authoritative volume, but it doesn't really beckon you so much into the kitchen. But it's the equivalent of what would have been the most lavish volume that you can imagine today, maybe like Nathan Myhrvold's Modernist Cuisine that costs something like $600 with the Amazon discount. It was very, very expensive, printed on vellum. Inside, all of the chapters opened with these wonderful woodcut vignettes. And I got worried when I heard Scott giving his introduction, and he said that my talk at the Detroit Institute of Arts had been hilarious. And I suddenly thought, oh no, do I have anything hilarious in this talk? Well, thank goodness. I have at least one hilarious, and I hope you'll find maybe two more hilarious slides. But the lobster was seen as the kind of animal embodiment of good, because lobsters would eat sea serpents, and serpents represent sin. So here you have the chapter opening for the lobster, but woe betide the cook who is a sinful man, he will be caught in the lobster's claws. So even if Marx Rumpold was really, kind of stiff in that way, there was some humor. You're finding this humorous too. Well, good. This is actually very serious. No. One of the most important genres of the 16th century was carving manuals. Carving was considered a great art. And this is by a man named Vincenzo Servio, published in 1581, called simply The Carver. And it's plate after plate of all of the different fowl and meats and fish and how to carve them, along with the implements to use. Here you have a turkey, which was very exciting in 1581, if you think about that, because the turkey is a New World bird. So it had only fairly recently been introduced into Europe, and of course the peacock, which had been around for a long time. And what the great carvers would do would be to impale the small birds on a fork, hold it up in the air. I guess they would do it if they were right-handed. They would hold it up, and then with a flourish, with their very sharp knife, they would carve the birds, and it would fall into this beautiful pattern. And there was a whole series of carving manuals, including by this expat German who lived in Italy named Matthias Jäger. And he published one in 1621, but he's much more interesting for this 1639 volume, which was called The Art of Folding. And what you see here is a pattern book for folding napkins. And it was meant as an inspiration, and all of these different shapes, the griffins and the two-headed eagles and these wondrous creatures, it was for inspiration on the table. Because one of the things I don't really have time to get into tonight, but so much of food goes beyond the actual cooking. It's the presentation that really makes the table sing, and it is, there's the phrase, you eat first with your eyes. That's why I really love studying cookbooks, because there is so much visual material. That's how you first comprehend what you're going to ingest, and it's very, very important. And all of you have been to banquets where there's a folded napkin. This is what they looked like in the 17th century. And he actually taught the art of napkin folding at the University of Padua. And I don't think Williams is going to put it on its curriculum anytime soon. But he worked with paper and used paper to do, for his students to do the practice folds. So over in England, there was very active cookbook publishing. And of course, by the 17th century, there was much greater literacy. This is a book from 1615 by a man named John Murrell called The New Book of Cookery. And what's significant here is, even though it's in this heavy black lettering and using this sort of medieval style of the catchword, you know, that was used in manuscripts and choirs so that you would know what order things were supposed to go in. The books were suddenly being published in larger numbers, on cheaper paper, in smaller format, and they were sharing secrets. So there's a change from being just for the professional kitchen to being for the housewife who could stick a book like this in her apron pocket and go into the kitchen and actually use it. His recipe for apple puffs is basically apple fritters, but he's very specific in the kind of apple to use, plum water or any other apple that is not hard or harsh. So we talk a lot about, you know, the local ingredients and how important that is. That's not anything new. A good cook will know that ingredients are important, and he goes again through technique, and it's very much a guiding hand in the kitchen. This is probably the most important English cookbook of the 17th century, The Accomplished Cook by John May. The original edition was 1660. This is a 1661. And it became very fashionable to have frontispieces like that, you know, with the authoritative cook. I said John May, I meant Robert May, sorry. I am Robert May, and down here it says, approved by the 55 years experience and industry of Robert May in his attendance on several persons of great honor. So you can be assured that my recipes will work. And besides that, I am revealing to you not just the art, but the mystery of cooking, wherein the whole art is revealed in a more easy and perfect method than hath been published in any language, lest you doubt his authority. But what's wonderful about his book is that there are a lot of fold-out plates in which he has illustrations of how foods are supposed to be made. And his pies are especially wonderful. It's a certain type of pie called the Florentine that can be filled with different kinds of things, as you see here, carp and different meats. And you have all of these wonderful different patterns. And if you're having trouble imagining what they look like, there's a great food historian in England named Ivan Day, who recreates a lot of old recipes. So here you can see what these beautiful pies that would be set on the English table might have looked like. Well, women were getting into the act in the 18th century, and it is, I think, fair to say that the 18th century in England, and then subsequently in the United States, was the century of the woman's cookbook. And Hannah Woolley published the first woman's cookbook in English, The Queen-like Closet, which appeared in 1670. I like this frontispiece better, so I decided to show this one. The Accomplished Lady's Delight in Preserving, Physic, Beautifying, and Cookery. So this is a much more intimate look at cooking. It's for the lady who runs the country household, who has a staff, perhaps, most likely, but even if she were to undertake many things herself, she could do it because it's not meant for the professional cook. And here in these wonderful illustrations, you see preserving kitchen. You see something more like the apothecary, that's the physic, which is the health part, the recipes that take us back to the original medicinal meaning of the word. The beautifying, here she is in front of her mirror, and luckily by that time in England they were no longer using lead to make their faces white. Lead powder was pretty nefarious. And of course, cooking, the actual culinary part. And this is Hannah Woolley looking, I think, much more fetching than Robert May. And this was plagiarized widely. But there was a lot of anxiety in the 18th century because things were changing and the service of the meal was changing. That's a topic for an entirely different talk. But basically, classical French style of service, where all the foods were arrayed on the table at once and then subsequently removed and a new course was brought out, was being replaced in the 18th century with a more intimate style of service. And there was a particular kind of late-night meal that was called the ambigu. And here you can say these ambigus have been performed by Charles Carter. So this is his 1730 cookbook. At several times and places, with the time of the year when done, which informs you what was then in season and proper. So, you know, the whole locavore movement here, everything about what we do is not new. It was very important then. But what's most striking in this table setting is that the desserts, a pyramid of sweetmeats and fruit in porcelains, the desserts were on the table, which was really more like a buffet, throughout the meal. And it's significant that it's in porcelain. This is 1730, and the art of making hard-paste porcelain had only recently been finally discovered in Meissen. And before that, everything had been imported from China. And so porcelain was still a very rare material. And here again is an Ivan Day recreation. And you can see this wonderful pyramid of fruits and sweetmeats, which are, you know, basically sweet things. They have nothing to do with meat. And the kind of pie that you would have found from Robert May, with the bird actually cooked and then stuffed again and put back into its plumage, because drama and presentation were so important. Some of the medieval feasts were really wonderful because they would put a piece of cotton in the beak of a peacock that had been reconstructed, and they would soak it in camphor, and then they would light it, and they would bring in the bird, and it was like a dragon flaming. I mean, truly spectacular. Not that I want to live in medieval times. Another genre of cookbook that is very important is the commonplace book. And that was basically a book that was kept by generations of women, passed down, and again, we're talking about affluent households, but passed down from mother to daughter and on and on. And so they weren't in any kind of organized categories like, you know, appetizers or desserts. It was just as things accumulated. This is the earliest known written recipe for ice cream in Europe, from a 1660 commonplace book that was kept by Lady Anne Fanshawe, whose husband had been the ambassador to the court of Spain under Charles II, and so probably because of the Islamic and Arabic influence in Spain, sorbet, which had come from the Middle East, if you think of the word sherbet, was originally a chilled drink in the Middle East. She had encountered ice cream there. Her taste still runs to the medieval instead of the new, fresher style that we find becoming more widespread in the 17th century. You can see, take a blade of mace, which is the outside filament of nutmeg, or else perfume it with orange flower water, is one word, orange flower water, or ambergris, which is ambergris, which is the secretion from the whale. And it was used a lot in medieval cookery to intensify flavor, sort of a musky flavor. It would be another century until 1768, when a man named Monsieur, we don't know his first name, Aimé, published L'art de bien faire les glaces, how to make ices and ice cream successfully. And it was very scientific because ice cream and the use of salt to keep things chilled had only recently been discovered. And so there was great excitement, and he spelled out how to do it. But interestingly, he used a lot of savory ingredients like truffles, and I'm not talking about chocolate, but you know, the fungi that grow underground. But I love his frontispiece because it's so full of fantasy. And here you see these wonderful cherubs who are making the ice cream, putting them into the handled glasses. They're getting the ice from the ice houses, which every affluent estate had to have, wheeling them in the wheelbarrow. They're churning the ice cream, putting in the glasses, and then carrying it off to the Lord and the Lady up there in the clouds. So now I'm going to leap into the 19th century. And the first celebrity chef, who was a man named Carême, Marie-Antoine Carême, and he was really extraordinary. He wrote so many cookbooks. He was called the king of chefs and the chef of kings because he cooked not only for King George IV and also for Alexander I of Russia. He cooked for Talleyrand. He was quite amazing. And he really was the first to codify classical French cuisine. And this is from his 1822 book that he wrote, The Steward, in which he shows the old style of the chef and the new, revealing the legs, style of the modern chef. But also here you see the beginnings of what we know as that billowing French chef toque, which until fairly recently was what all upstanding chefs wore. Carême is famous for many things, most of all for what are known as pièces montées, which are sculptures for the table. They're centerpieces that were made out of sugar paste or sometimes an edible dough, although mostly they were just for decoration and not meant to be eaten. But they're like an edible historiography because you can trace all of these different styles. He had thousands of them. So here you have ancient ruins. Here you have a mosque, something more like a basilica. And they were all, you have to imagine that they were dyed with vegetable dyes. So they would use sandalwood to get a brilliant red, or cochineal. I know that's a beetle, it's not a vegetable, but that also gave this beautiful deep carmine color. You could use saffron for yellow, spinach for green. And so they were these extraordinary architectural constructions. And some years ago, I happened upon this amazing portfolio he had done of architectural monuments for St. Petersburg, because he'd been invited to St. Petersburg by Alexander I to cook for him there. And he got to St. Petersburg from Paris and was really miffed that the Tsar wasn't there to meet him, to meet his boat. And I am the great French chef Carême, and he's not there to meet me. So he never stayed. He was there for 2 weeks till the next boat went out. But he spent those 2 weeks looking at the city, the capital of an empire that he felt was too flat for an empire. There wasn't anything sort of commanding and vertical enough. So he did all these amazing architectural constructions, not thinking that St. Petersburg was built on a swamp, a reason that there weren't towering monuments. So over the course of the 19th century, as printing technology improved, chromolithography became more and more affordable. And by if you need the exact date, I can look it up. It's something like 1865. A man named Jules Gouffet published this book on l'art culinaire. And he also did a whole book on pastry and confections. One of the things that Carême had said, or is said to have said, is that the 5 arts are 5 in number. There's painting, sculpture, music, poetry, and architecture, of which the main branch is confectionery. And I love that quote. I think he's right. So it was very important to do highly decorated things, and all of these chefs and cookbook writers got different monikers. And Gouffet was known as the apostle of decoration, which I think you can see here. But for the first time, all of these illustrations that we've seen are in vivid color. So here I just thought I'd show you that because we talked about carving. So he had very practical plates. This book had something like 25 chromolithographs in it. And this is for a timbale à la Milanaise. How many of you saw Big Night, the movie Big Night, Stanley Tucci? Well, it's a great movie if you ever want to get it on Netflix. But the big thing for the opening of their restaurant is at Timbale. And this shows just how lavish the decorations were. By 1885, we had plates that folded out. This is an English cookbook published by a man named Theodore Francis Garrett called the Encyclopedia of Cookery, which appeared in 4 volumes and then was shortly thereafter published in the United States as well. And here you see just how important the architectural constructions and the decoration of the table is. And of course you have this late Victorian excess of the palms and everything else so that you have an entire atmosphere that is evoked when you walk into the dining room. So jumping across the ocean to the United States, how many of you know about Fanny Farmer? Okay, so I have a love-hate relationship with her, I have to confess. She was the founder of the Boston Cooking School. And it was wonderful because she gave real weight to the importance of cooking by calling it domestic science and home economics, you know, by sort of giving it this social science thing and making it not just a woman cooking in the kitchen. She gave it a kind of gravitas. But she was also really into standardization, which I think killed people's ability to cook because they were no longer cooking by sight, by smell, by feel, or by taste. They started following recipes, which I think has absolutely been disastrous for cooking in the United States. We need to get, you know, our senses back in the kitchen. But in addition to doing her famous Boston Cooking School cookbook, in 1907 she published this food and cookery for the sick and convalescent. And if only the sick and convalescent in hospitals now were regaled with the likes of these, again, architectural creations. It's so much about how you feel. You know, if you get a little plastic bowl with Jell-O in it, you don't want to eat that. You're just going to get sicker. If you're served something like this, you know, it might inspire the appetite. And, of course, broiled oysters, you know, I'll take that any day. But the reason I decided to show this is to show that by the early 20th century in the United States, photography was now being used to illustrate rather than chromolithography. So now I'm really jumping ahead because I have you know, a limited amount of time. But I decided to show you small press books. A wonderful press from San Francisco, founded in 1938, called the Colt Press, that did all of its books on letterpress. They're just exquisite. Mostly they did novels. They worked very closely with the artist Mallet Dean. I don't know if you know him, but he did woodcuts. And they did this very unique for the time series called The Epicure, between 1938 and 1941. And Jane Grabhorn, who was one of the founders, along with William Roth, who was a scion of the Matson shipping line, so there was money to do these beautiful letterpress books, did the typography. So the first 3 were the Epicure in China, Mexico, and Hawaii, because of course those were 3 demographic groups you would have found in San Francisco. And then they were all 6x5. On the binding was boards, but they were covered in paper like this one was meant to simulate bamboo. The outlier is this beautiful, the Epicure in Imperial Russia, which is bound in linen and really gorgeous and was a much, with deckled edges and a very lavish volume. But this is the interior of the Mexican one. And you can see interspersed with the recipes are menus, so it's already contextualizing things. And significantly, we have the ingredients that are separated out from the narrative recipe block that we are so used to seeing there were other ones before this, but this is a very nice example. It's good for a couple of reasons. You can sort of eyeball it and know what ingredients to get at the store, but also when you're cooking your way through the recipe, you can refer to the ingredient list and not have the quarter cup or whatever it is embedded in the text. So it really is a very good typographic aid to the cook to help you work through a recipe. And what the 20th century did is to make recipes a lot more visual to help cooks get through things. Here, the recipes are already very familiar. This is familiar in their format, a 1942 cookbook called the Wartime Cookbook. Victory, what was it? I can check my notes, but it's something like Victory Strategies or something like that, and it's a very good example of cookbooks as propaganda. Stop, loose talk to strangers, enemy ears are alert. You don't necessarily expect to find this in a cookbook, but it gives strategies for rationing because sugar was rationed. All of that was going into sending the sugar to the troops. So you have honey spice cake, you have a fruit cake that's made with brown sugar and honey instead of with refined white sugar. What I love, meats are the protein army, so it's this militaristic vocabulary, but what I love best about this and why I chose this page is because if you have leftover meat, leftover stew, it's not like a gourmet dish. You can make it that way. You can take it and you can put it in a ring of rice. Again, presentation is important. Or you can take those pieces of meat and put them on a skewer. And look at this beautiful pinwheel that you get. The recipe, which is leftover meat and rice, réchauffé au lait. You give it a French name. It's reheated with milk, and it is a gourmet dish. So 1957, the war was over. America was in its post-war boom. Everyone's this is the era I grew up in. It was like really everything was wonderful, or at least we thought it was. There were a lot of promotional cookbooks published. This is just a little one published by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. We can parse that later if you want. But look at the illustrations. So one of the things that started happening in cookbooks was they moved away from heavy photography for a while, and there were all of these whimsical drawings and line drawings. So here you have your happy plates and your happy vegetables and your onion, and you just vegetables are your friends, and you just want to have fun in the kitchen. But counteracting that is this. What is this message? You have the measuring cup, and it is giving equivalence. Capital block letters, no beautiful cursive here. All measurements should be level. Use standard 8-ounce measuring cups. Use standard measuring spoons. It is so prescriptive, and I think this is the kind of thing that destroys cooking. Sorry. But this is the table of weights and measures that, sort of brings down this sort of fun thing. So then we come to 1961, something you're all very familiar with, Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cookery, now having a revival. And the very cover of it speaks Frenchness, red, white, and blue, the colors of the Republic. The pattern is the fleur-de-lis. But I want you to look at the layout of the recipe for this a brioche that is made in the form of a crown instead of the standard one that has a little tête on top. So line drawings, and you have actual hands. Julia is lending a helping hand. The hand is there with you, showing you exactly how to do the shaping of a brioche, how to do every step. Everything is spelled out. Those of you who know the cookbook know that the recipes go on and on and on for pages. Nothing is left to chance. She is there to guide you. The antithesis to that is the 1965 Len Dayton Action Cookbook, which is going to be reissued next month in its United States edition as Len Dayton's Cooking for Men. So if we had Julia Child's female hand helping you in the kitchen, here, if you're male and you cook, if you don't know Len Dayton, he was a British thriller writer, and he wrote the Ipcress file that Michael Caine starred in. So here you start seeing celebrity blurbs on cookbooks. But this was also the James Bond era. So if you know how to cook spaghetti, wearing your gun in a holster, of course, then you are going to be the man in the kitchen, and you know what it's going to lead to, which is what it's all about. But what's interesting about his book, you know, apart from that whole macho thing, is that his recipes are really graphic. They're visual guides, step by step, to take you through the recipe. They're called cook strips, you know, like comic strips. So here you have Boeuf Bourguignon, the father figure of beef stew, which I love. But you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can really follow the visual recipe. And unlike Julia's helping hand, here it's all about the equipment. You see the pot, you see the ingredients, but you don't have that sort of, embracing element. So this is, oh good, I'm glad you're laughing, because this was another one of the hilarious ones. 1972. Making chicken soup. What is more quintessential than your mother's chicken soup? What is more quintessential than your mother's chicken soup is your mother half naked making her chicken soup. This is Les Crims's mother. He was Cindy Sherman's teacher at Buffalo. So she's become very famous. He's not as well known. He should be. It's a beautiful book, but it's all visual. This is how the recipe appears. So you have the photograph of her each step of the way, and then you have minimal text. The recipe for the soup appears at the front of the book, and then at the back of the book are 2 little recipes, one for matzo balls, because of course you can't have chicken soup without matzo balls, unless you're like me and you really want kreplach, which are the meat-filled dumplings. And so there are 3 actual regular format recipes, but this is how you learn to make chicken soup. It's a tiny volume. I actually have it. I could not resist buying it. It's about this big, but it's brilliant. But the quintessential artist book is Andy Warhol's Wild Raspberries, which he first did in 1959 as a series of 18 lithographs with a society maven named Susie Frankfurt in New York City. The book actually appeared as this book in 1997, but there were original beautiful hand-colored lithographs for recipes that cannot necessarily be cooked. The whole idea was it was a spoof on Wild Strawberries, Bergman's film, and also on, you know, the hostess with the mostess kind of idea. This is how to be the perfect hostess. You might want to make roast iguana and delusion, and I will just read that to you. Since this, it was his mother who did the lettering. She did the calligraphy. She was not 100% literate, and he left all of her spelling mistakes in. Since this reptile is not met with on the American market and is only found in better gourmet shops on the Galapagos Islands, it is superfluous to give recipes concerning its preparation. Let it suffice to say they are prepared like the Burmese lizard. And this is his centerpiece, which is the piglet. And here, and the original lithograph has this beautiful gold foil that was attached to it, so it just shimmers. And this one instructs you to go and get your chauffeur, to take the Cadillac, to go to the store, pick it up at the side entrance, and bring it home. And that's how you make the piglet. I'll put in a little plug for the Williams College Museum of Art, which just in 2 weeks is opening an exhibition on Warhol and the book. and they have this in in our collection. So if any of you find yourselves in Williamstown, please come to see it. So the antithesis of this sort of edgy New York, Andy Warhol world is, of course, California. And if you think of the early 1970s and Alice Waters and Chez Panisse and the whole California ingredient, local-driven movement, which is very much how many of us aspire to, not necessarily me, but a lot of us aspire to eat today. We have the 1973 Tassajara Cookbook, Tassajara Cooking, and he did a bread book too. So this is Edward S.B. Brown from the Zen Center, the Mountain Zen Center, and it couldn't be further from the Warhol aesthetic. So you see that it's done in these earth tones of brown and cream. This is actually more cream than you can see on the slide. There's this earthy texture. The food comes right out of the landscape being in the skillet, and it sort of looks like a Japanese print, you know, with these mountains in the distance. There's something spiritual about it all. And as opposed to those prescriptive recipes, he's saying here, pale green snow. This grape salad could also be a dessert. And here are the ingredients, but there are no measurements. So it's all about let your inspiration be your guide. Meditate and feel what is right, and then go with it. So this is the sort of the reason I love studying cookbooks is because they really are social documents that capture a zeitgeist and tell you so much about the era. They also are aspirational. Every cookbook is aspirational because you want to make something that is either good for your health or will impress your guests or make you feel good or whatever it is. There's always an ideal to be reached. And there is a partnership of a pair of artists in Paris, Dora Maltz and Su Chen Chen, who did these beautiful illustrations. I first encountered them when I was working on Gastronomica, and they have since published this just a couple of years ago. Le Grimoire des Vénus, the Book of Spells is how it's translated into English. And this is a butterfly soup. And what it does really is harken back to the alchemical texts. So you're taking things that you don't necessarily think of as edible, but you're trying to turn them into something else. And the idea here is to capture the ephemeral. You're supposed to take 4 varieties of butterflies in September when they're most filled with the sun and therefore most beautiful. And then you put them into this soup with all kinds of very exotic spices and wild blackberries and wild raspberries and essence of mandarin petals and cloves and stuff like that. But they photograph all of these dishes, and I think it's just gorgeous. But the recipe format is very familiar. There's a head note, which is explanatory, the ingredients, and then the instructions. Another fairly recent book from 2006 by the English designer Jake Tilson harkens back to a different cookbook genre that we've looked at, the commonplace book. So here he's taking recipes from his family and from other families, and he's put them together in this wonderful scrapbook-like format so that you have the sense of each person's expressiveness. This is his father's pumpkin pie. And you have the handwriting there as though it was right on the recipe card. And you have the photographs that have been added, but also these old illustrations for glassware and bits of fabric, so you can imagine what the kitchen might look like. And it's really a hodgepodge, and it's very busy pages, but it's also very expressive and very evocative. So I'm just going to show you a few more because I want to leave time for questions, but some very recent ones. This is from a popular Seattle local bakery, and I want to show it to you because it's the kind of cookbook we have come to expect. So you have this lush food photography on the cover, and it's mouthwatering. You know, you want these cupcakes, and of course they're cupcakes. Cupcakes will soon be eclipsed by something else, but at the moment they're still having their day. And photography is used not just to illustrate the recipe so that you know what it's supposed to look like with professional food styling, but it also becomes the backdrop. it becomes the page itself. So you feel as though you're right there in the bakery with these cotton towels, there's flour everywhere, the wooden cooking spoons, and it really tries to draw you in. The recipes are entirely familiar to us in terms of their layout on the page. You have nutritious before delicious, which is what this bakery is trying to convey, you know, that their food's healthy, made with granola, which of course if you've ever made granola, you know is one of the most calorific foods you can ever eat, because if you want it to taste good, you have to use tons of oil. But that aside, you have the ingredient list so that you can see it very quickly, go to the store, make your shopping list, but also refer to it quickly. You have an extensive head note that will either give you personal information, historical information, yumminess factor, whatever the cookbook author decides to give, and then numbered steps so that everything is explicit. I'm finishing a cookbook now, and I'm in a certain way going out of my mind because everything, you know, I say melt the butter melt the butter. So the copy editor comes back over what kind of heat, what kind of saucepan. I'm like, I don't want to say that. Let them burn it, and then they'll know next time to use low heat. Or let them put it in a huge stock pot, and then they'll know next time that if you have a tablespoon of butter, use a smaller. And that's the only way you can learn to cook, and I don't want to spell it out. But, you know. But you also have this beautiful food photography, and here this kitchen twine is meant to convey an earthiness and a wholesomeness, but you have a close-up of the food that is mouth-watering. So this is what basically we've come to expect in a cookbook. Also, celebrity chefs. How many of you have been to Alinea in Chicago? Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to recommend necessarily that you go there because you'll spend hundreds of dollars and you won't necessarily end up satisfied in that deep, you know, stomach-satisfying way. But if you are interested in food and performance, it's a place to go, and it's very titillating to the senses. But Grant Achatz is the chef there. And here, if you think back to Robert May, his 1660 cookbook, The Accomplished Cook, and there he is in the frontispiece with authority. Here you've got the chef with his kitchen brigade. And of course, the whole terminology of the French kitchen is very militaristic. And you see his food, which is, you know, sort of geometric and all metallic and very hard-edged. But it's about presentation, and the chef as the authority. No one can cook from these cookbooks. It will not turn out if you don't have all these guys in the kitchen. Believe me, I have tried. I have one wonderful guy in the kitchen, but I don't want him to cook this way. But chefs communicate their philosophy through their cookbooks. And so this is Andoni Luis Aduriz, who is the chef at Mugaritz, which is an amazing cookbook. It's an amazing restaurant in the Basque Country. And he's communicating something different that I think even from this slide you immediately see. It's all about connection with nature. You see the vines. It's organic. He is not the chef. He's the thoughtful philosopher. He's thinking about what to make for you. And even the table of contents, which is why typography is so telling in these cookbooks. It's like the calendar and the season. So how do you progress from one season to the next, and what will you make? So if you really start studying cookbooks, you learn a tremendous amount about who the writer is. So what can we expect in the future? There's, I think, a rather amazing pair working in Berlin now, Nora Luther and Pavel Becker, who are trying to reconceptualize what a recipe is. And they haven't published their work in a book yet. I hope that they will. But what they're doing is taking recipes with the proportioned ingredients. So that, to me, looks like it's a good tablespoon of butter. You have the 2 fillets of fish. You have lemon, and you have some fresh thyme, and you have olive oil in, you know, I would say 2 tablespoons or something like that. but the cook is having to think. This is couscous, garlic, greens, and again, olive oil. So here's the recipe. The recipe is entirely visual. You have to enter into that space and then start imagining, what will it be? How can I make it my own? Instead of slavishly following, this is the standard measurement, make sure that you use it. I think this kind of thing can be very liberating. This is the latest addition to my cookbook collection. I just got it last week. And it is the In Vitro Meat Cookbook. It was published in Amsterdam. Amsterdam is really where they're doing all of these experiments with culturing meat from tissue. So we talk about food culture. This is literal culture in a petri dish. Bizarre cookbook from which you cannot cook. So is this a cookbook? Well, it has recipes in the standard format, a headnote, an illustration, and then the ingredients and the steps listed. The one I decided to show you is for in vitro bacon on a roll. I'll just read you some of it. Toilet paper meets bacon. Oh good, you're laughing again. For the ultimate convenience food. Snip off slivers to add to stir fry. Wrap yourself in bacon and go dressed as a meat mummy for your next costume party. But it's not entirely utilitarian. While some rolls use the traditional stripy pattern, others can have the fat printed in cute patterns of frolicking piglets and puppies. So making your own food in a laboratory means that the sky's the limit. And if we look at this shimmering see-through sashimi that has been cultured from the tissue of bluefin tuna, who's to say that it's not more delicious than actually having bluefin tuna, which is an endangered species that we shouldn't be eating, but if you take a sliver of it and you create something gorgeous like this, then maybe there will be a future to food. Thank you.